Hi and welcome back. Today I'm just going to do another quick sort of neutral painting using what's left on my palette. I've been moving house recently in the last couple of weeks, so as you can imagine I've been very busy and a bit unsettled. So to try and settle into my new studio arrangements, I shall just stick with familiar territory and just paint a sort of really gentle, peaceful, neutral scene using these colours that I've got left on my palette. Now what I've got here is Paynes grey, there's some indigo, raw sienna, and I think there might be a tiny bit of perylene green. And if I mix them all up together with a bit of water, then I can get this lovely neutral greenish grey. And I think it makes a lovely base for just sort of practice pieces, figure practice and things like that, because it sets the scene. I've wet the paper all over, and then I'm just going to run in a graduated wash using a well pigmented mix, but allowing it to run down and diffuse on the paper, and also letting it become lighter towards the middle, then pulling it in a bit darker across the bottom, but keeping it quite patchy across the bottom so I get some variation in the tone. As the paint runs down the page, because my board's at an angle of 45 degrees, I use a clean damp brush to sort of do two jobs. One is to pull out a hint of a horizon line, and the other one is to mop up any sort of beads of water that kind of pool along near the horizon or anywhere else, because they could cause runbacks, because those pools of water will dry a lot more slowly than the rest of the page, and if that happens, that's when the drip can then run back into the drier page and cause a nasty mark. My paper is Saunders Waterford. It's cold pressed, it's 140 pound or 300 grams weight, and it's taped to my board with decorator's masking tape. I've used a large and an extra large and a medium Ron Ranson hake brush by Pro Arte for this so far. Now, just darkened up across the bottom, and now I shall leave it to dry completely and then come back and just add a few very simple figures. So now it's completely dry. It's dried back a little bit lighter, but with some very interesting tonal variations. It's given me this kind of really nice, very plain, sort of almost foggy sky. And what I'm going to take for a sort of reflective expanse of beach or sand or something like that. And now using my small calligraphy brushes, I shall just do some figure practice and put in a couple of people walking across the sand, then maybe a few more in the distance. Just looking for something very impressionistic and slightly abstracted here. As I say, I'm quite finding it quite difficult to get used to my new studio surroundings, even though it's very lovely. Something new is always a bit strange because I knew exactly where everything was in my last setup, but at the moment it's all a little bit unfamiliar. The lights are different, things like that. So it's quite nice just to sort of stick to some old favourites, just to kind of get myself back into it and get used to my surroundings and get to know where I'm keeping things. I should probably do a new studio tour at some point once I'm completely sorted and settled. So I've got this figure, these two figures that I've painted. These are my foreground figures, and I've mixed together Paynes grey and some indigo, keeping it nicely pigmented, but still with a little bit of variation here and there. And I've painted the couple sort of joined together like this, so it's like an amorphous blob with two heads. But if you paint these sort of shapes carefully, with a bit of practice, you can actually get these kind of blobs to look like people. So these shapes represent people, and somehow these sorts of loose figures have a lot more sort of expressiveness and movement in them than if you were to paint a sort of a more exact and more detailed figure. I'm not sure what it is. I think the eye and the brain likes to interpret these kind of marks and enjoys kind of seeing the swing of a raincoat or the step of a leg from just a few sort of suggestions of brush strokes. If you're painting here, you could of course always put in a dog. That would be quite nice. So you've got a couple walking the dog at low tide across the sands. And pulling down a reflection is quite an important part of this composition. It's what really helps to cement that idea that the couple are walking on sort of glistening sand or a wet surface of some sort. So pulling down firstly with the calligraphy brush and then establishing it with the tips of a flat brush with horizontal brush strokes, being careful to stay within the profile below the figures, helps to really cement that illusion. And I'm finding this painting quite calming. It's quite nice to sort of help me to settle back into my studio. And I think this sort of figure practice can be quite sort of meditative, especially using such sort of neutral, soft and calming colours as these. Sort of a bit like a relaxation exercise, or you could use it as an exercise to sort of loosen up and get yourself in the mood for a more prepared, planned and a more complex painting. It could be quite a nice way of, as I say, warming up if you're going to have a session of painting. So this is a few more distant people, keeping the heads at the same level because it's a flat landscape. This time a little family, I think. A couple and a child, painting exactly the same sort of way, but just smaller, obviously, and sort of less distinct, so that it looks like they're more distant. If it goes on and looks as dark as the foreground couple, then you can just dab off with a tissue while it's still wet, and that just takes a bit of the darkness out. It makes the figures a lot paler and helps them to look as if they, to give you some aerial perspective, so you get a sense of recession. And that's an important part of this exercise, I think, is trying to make sure that all the figures are in the right sort of perspective and the right proportion. Keeping the heads on the same level really works well for indicating the distance that you want in this flat landscape. I mean, there are no other features. It's very plain. It's only the people and the figures that are going to give you this sense of distance. It's quite fun to sort of work as minimally as this. It's a very sort of minimalist painting, I suppose, but very enjoyable too. Just a lone figure to sort of change up the dynamic. So we've got a couple, we've got a family, and a lone figure, and then their shadows or reflections as well. Again, the reflections of the distant people need to be sort of a lot paler, a lot less distinct as the reflections that I've given to the foreground couple. And then lastly, just a few tiny brush strokes just to indicate a few people even further away, and keeping them very, very pale, quite watery paint for that. maybe darken up a little bit here and there as the paint dries in my main figures, just to deepen some of the shadows and differentiate between both figures. And I'm going to leave it at that. It's another one of those paintings where less is more, but of course you could add more carefully. There could be some birds, some seagulls in the sky. You could have a couple of dogs running around, things like that. You could put in a few more details, maybe a distant headland, that sort of thing. But I think I'm going to keep it simple like this for this demonstration and leave the rest up to your imagination if you try a scene like this. So thanks so much for watching. Please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon. And happy painting. Bye.